For me, it's a story, I think, that can shed a lot of light on stigma and the influence stigma is having in the wider aspect of things. It's also a story of, I feel, transformation, and it's a story of breakthrough. In addition, for me, and this would be my own personal aspect to the story, it's a story I am hoping that allows me to share some of the discoveries I made by going through this particular extraordinary 17-month experience I went through all those years ago. What I will share about this, I have no expectation that anybody should accept what I'm saying. For me, it's a celebration of an opportunity for my voice to be heard.
We were very close. We were both introverts. You know, I'd always go to him for advice. You know, we'd have long talks. He'd bring us all to the cinema. He'd bundle us all into the car, like all the neighborhood kids. He always looked into the deeper meaning behind things. He was always exploring alternative health sort of stuff. So like he was different, yeah. He feels that things got out of hand, he was wronged, and now it was about other people having their eyes opened to what actually happened.
My life, of course, was very good. We had come back from California in 1990, where the whole family of Mary, Karen, Jeannie and myself had spent 3 years in California, and I was doing a master's in psychology in university in San Francisco. So that had influenced our lives very strongly. And then a year before this 17-month experience entered and emerged through my life, I was already getting a strong sense that there was something on the horizon. And for example, I wrote my daughter Karen a letter and I said, "Karen, when saying goodbye to you at the airport, you may remember me telling you that I was entering a whole new area of discovery in my life. Since then, much new understanding and clarity has flooded into my world." My father was quite an important influence in my life, not just because he founded the original Central Garage about 8 years ago or longer in New Ross, but in his will, he left me the Central Garage here in Clonmel. And that relationship with that company, since I took it over in 1974, has been an enormous influence in my life.
I had started originally in the Central Garage in 1970, and I stayed there for 34 years. There was a lot of flow of cars coming and going all the time, but then when Eddie came to Clonmel, he got more hands-on, got fairly well acquainted with Eddie in that stage. Eddie was concerned about how people were treated, and I was a bit surprised that, because it was something I hadn't come across ever before. We say where the owner, the boss in the business, was so concerned about his staff, and he indicated like that he'd like to change things, and that he would like to have a much better work environment. And that's the way it took off from there. Eddie is a man of principle, and that's the description that I would use if I had to say it in one or two words.
Myself and the audit team leader at the time, Frank McKevitt, went to the Central, and that purpose of that meeting was to discuss the accounts function of the company, really. At that point in time, it was a complete mess, to be honest. It wasn't making money. So the outlook really was pretty bleak. In particular, a company with that kind of debt, I couldn't see any way out, really, to be honest, other than, liquidating the company and just getting out, basically.
Mary, my wife, was continuously coming under pressure by a particular outside accountant that this company needed to be sold or else it was going to crash. He is telling her, if it's not sold in the following week, the people that are interested in buying it will withdraw their interest, and he's telling her the company is going to collapse, it's going to go bankrupt, and there'll be nothing left. So that's the fear she was being placed under.
Eddie first came under my radar in early September 2001, when his GP made contact with me and asked me to see him. I remember very vividly walking down the stairs. When I got to the bottom, I saw this man pacing up and down the corridor. He had his hands in his pocket and he was kind of slouching forward and he was extremely thin. I asked, "Are you Mr. O'Brien?" And he said he was. "Mr. O'Brien, can you see any light at the end of the tunnel at this point?" And he said, "Dr. Casey, not only do I not see any light, but I don't even see the tunnel."
I end up being diagnosed with what's called bipolar 3. So if somebody is viewing me from outside, I'm the only one in here. The perspective somebody is getting will come from outside, but there are things going on in you that only are available for your awareness. Having said all of that, I can perfectly understand the medical profession have only available to them an outside view of a person. One of the reasons, for example, I wasn't taking medication throughout all of this whole experience, because I knew from the inside I wasn't having a mental illness or a mental experience.
His wife told me that he had had 2 different antidepressants and hadn't responded. So I changed the antidepressants and still no improvement. If I remember rightly, he may have been on lithium at the time, and lithium is the only one that can be detected. I got a telephone call from his wife, Mary, to say Eddie had gone missing.
So that morning, I already knew that if I go down to my local doctor, he would do the blood test and then he would discover, and everybody would discover, I wasn't taking any of the medication at all. When I drive then and I meet the Crossroads, right is down into Tramore where the doctor resides, left is out the coast road. I had no intention of going missing or not coming back later on that evening. So when I turned left, I was driving further and further away from Tramore, and I start to get the sense that I'm now gone so far and it's so late in the day, I can't really go back. I arrive in a town called Ennis, 6 o'clock in the evening. The only respite from the constant suffering was I was sleeping. So it was like once I curled up in the bed, I would go asleep. When I wake up the next morning, I'm already realizing Mary and the family will now be thinking, oh my God, he hasn't come home. He may have committed suicide. From my perspective, Mary has gone through so much because she was living with this man who couldn't tell her, for reasons only he knew, or couldn't tell anybody else, what was going on. One of the elements of my suffering was that there was nothing I could do to rescue her from her suffering. I drive on and I go as far as Galway city and then out to the sea at Salt Hill, and that's where I stay. Each day goes by and I'm thinking, oh my God, obviously it would be a great relief for Mary in particular, me knowing what she'd gone through, if I had killed myself. How can I break the news to them that I'm not gone, which would remove that sense of relief?
Everyone was out looking in different parts of the country, so we got in the car and headed up, randomly just picked a spot to look for him.
I heard the door being knocked on, and when I opened it, there was 2 guards there. They had already communicated back to the family where I was.
We were so relieved that he'd been found. We were so relieved. But we knew that that wasn't the end of it.
When I was in the Garda station, Mary phoned and I answered the phone, and Mary was sounding so joyful that I was found alive that I actually said to myself, she couldn't really be feeling joyful. How could she? knowing that I was still alive. When I arrive at the Mater Hospital, Mary is waiting for me, and when I get out of the car, she comes straight over to me and she hugs me.
Eddie was located in Galway and was brought back to see me, and he agreed to be admitted. So he was admitted to the psychiatric unit in the Mater Hospital under my care on the 8th of December. It was while he was in hospital that we discovered he actually hadn't taken any of the other antidepressants he had been prescribed. So he was now in hospital and getting them. After Christmas, he had weekends at home, and we decided he was going to be discharged sometime in the middle of January and follow him up closely as an outpatient.
I spent approximately, I think it was about 3 weeks in the Mater Hospital. And it was while I was in the Mater Hospital, actually 12th of January 2002, a new question emerged in me, the breakthrough about what the whole initiation was about. It was in a sense an initiation by life itself. Because I had emerged now with what I knew were new strengths, like first of all question, is this really something real? And then within a day I know it is real. Throughout the 3 weeks, approximately from the 12th of January to the 2nd of February, I'm in a completely different place, not only internally, but from anybody looking in outside, externally. But during that time, they're wondering, well, is this the bipolar dimension? Will I be back the other way after a few days? And of course, a few days go by and I'm not. I'm maintaining this very different experience that I'm now in.
In the Mater though, I visited him like a lot, and at first he was not responsive, but then there was one day I went in to visit him and he started talking to me like as if nothing had happened. He started just chatting to me, and yeah, so I think that was probably when he had his breakthrough.
While I'm still in the Mater Hospital, I'm realizing that this new inner freedom, which has brought these new strengths, I can now save this business. But by then, it was almost sold. There was contracts had been created. And then a few days before I was discharged from the Mater Hospital, I had already said to Mary that maybe it'd be an idea to see can we get a better deal. Consequently then, I was discharged from the Mater Hospital on the 2nd of February 2002, and that then would lead into an extraordinary event of the following week. And I'm straight away working on my proposal that I'm going to make to the directors, because the directors' meeting has been scheduled for the following Friday, February the 8th. I discover there was a completely different individual who had worked with me for years, had contacted me to say that he had an investor interested in buying the company or buying a share in it. And he arranged a meeting between myself and that investor, a person called Noel Power. The sort of money is being talked about is almost double what the other people are going to be paying.
Eddie was interested in selling the business he had in Clonmel, which was a garage business, and myself and John were interested in buying part of it. I knew that the business in Clonmel had a great potential, so I felt it was certainly worth looking at and giving it a serious analysis as to whether it was worth investing in. I knew Eddie for a good number of years. He was a very sensible businessman. He wasn't a high roller. He was steady Eddie. So I would have been quite comfortable getting involved with him in a business. And we were all three convinced, yes, that there was a deal about to be concluded.
So when I met with Noel Power and John, the deal was going to be, Noel Power had money to invest. He was a very successful businessman, and he had experience of the motor trade. We talked further about the actual price. And I said, now we've already agreed a figure in principle. The directors' meeting, I'm going to be presenting the fact that they now are seriously interested. I was also aware, of course, that John had worked in the company, so the people in the company knew he was already very successful. I'm assuming everybody will see the sense of what I'm saying. And also, I'd spoken to one of the directors beforehand, and I was totally confident that he was going to vote for my proposal. And I had the casting vote. So if he voted and I voted, my proposal was going to be carried, because there was only 4 directors and I had a casting vote.
It was the most probably tense day of my life, heading to this directors' meeting, and I knew that I was going to vote for the sale of the business. And Eddie was on his way up, trying to stop the sale. In my case, I was voting for the sale for the sake of Mary O'Brien and for Eddie, because if something is not done soon, there'll be nothing left for him. So that was my main concern.
His history of going missing and being in mental institution, everyone else thought he was, crazy and that he would put the business in jeopardy. Nobody was really giving him the opportunity and sitting back and going, actually, yeah, maybe he is making sense.
When I arrived at the meeting, as soon as I walked into the room, I could feel this weight of energy, which I probably should have anticipated, but I didn't. It's the weight of projection that occurs in the direction of people who are perceived to have mental illness. It's the power of stigma, you see. Gosh, this room brings back extraordinary memories for me. This is the room we had the famous directors' meeting of the 8th of February 2002. And it really brings back memories. I remember when I walked into the room, because everybody was sitting around, but we had a big circular table and there was 9 people attending the meeting, and when I walked in, I was immediately struck by the projections were coming in my direction. It was a bit naive of me at the time not to have expected that, but I didn't expect it. As I started at that directors' meeting, sharing the different aspects of what this offer was, I hadn't then even got a chance to go into the second part of the meeting, and I called for the vote to be made. To my amazement, the director that I was sure was voting with me voted against me, and suddenly I was now outvoted. And with that, there was chaos in the room. I mean, what can I do to save this company from this catastrophe that's happening? And I rang Solicitor in Tramore and I said, I'm in a predicament here. Can you advise me legally? And he said, well, who owns the shares of the company? And I said, I do. Well, he said, then you're okay, because you're in a position that you can call a new directors' meeting and you can appoint new directors. When I finished the call, one of them said to me, look, we've just phoned John and he's denying all of what you're after saying at this meeting, that it didn't happen at all. And I thought, what? That's impossible. It must be a misunderstanding. So I tried to phone John on his mobile, but that wasn't answering. And then I tried to phone Noel Power, but I only have his work number. And of course, it's after closing time and I can't get him. At that stage then, I can't understand what's going on here.
I remember he must have made a phone call to John and asked him had he made such an offer. And the answer he got back was, I never made any such offer. It's a total and utter bull, and you can quote me on that. Those were his words. Unbelievable. It was just totally unbelievable. Eddie was medically being treated. We had no reason to disbelieve John.
Had I been called, I would have confirmed, yes, there was absolutely a serious expression of interest. I mean, I wouldn't waste my time going to a meeting, or I wouldn't waste other people's time.
There was a lot of confusion then. Mary was, at this stage, I would say, really close to nervous breakdown, because now she's so worried about me, she probably thinks I'm totally off the wall altogether, maybe even psychotic. And Tony Kine is just lost in the midst of all this, and obviously perceiving that I must be really, really unstable at this stage. I've been impacted by such an amount of confusion on this one day that I need to go for a walk on the beach. So I started to go for a walk and I got physically sick. I vomited. Next morning I get up. I realised when I started talking to Mary, she's perceiving something seriously wrong with me. Karen and Jeannie then, they arrived down on the bus. one of them is behaving quite strange because they're all perceiving now I'm really in serious need of being back in hospital. Then Mary says to me, this doctor was calling up as well. And at that stage, the first red flag goes off. Mary was in the kitchen, Karen was in the kitchen, Jeannie and myself, including a complete stranger. This doctor comes in and he says something at the start like, well, Eddie, how are you? And I say, I'm fine. But then he launches in very quickly into, well, you need to be back in hospital. And I said, there's nothing wrong with me. And he got very, very aggressive. And there's no such thing as him coming in, evaluating me by bringing me down to the sitting room on my own or anything. This is all happening in a public space with a stranger. He was acting extremely abusively and extremely unprofessionally.
On that day, I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't get a good feeling about the whole situation. I didn't think he was in a good place, and I just wanted him to be in hospital.
After only about 10 or 15 minutes, he more or less is leaving now, and I realise he's now signing whatever form with regard to me being sectioned. So then he leaves, all in the space of about 15 minutes. Ambulance arrives, and they say, well, are you going to come? And I said, no, I'm definitely not coming. I said, there's nothing wrong with me. So eventually they leave, and when they realise there's no way I'm going to go voluntarily. So then the guards arrive. And the two guards come into the house, and once again, in my perception, they're not doing anything wrong, they're just following the rules. Then I said to them, what happens if I don't go? They said, well, we'll have to phone the station, get more guards down here and physically carry out of the house. And of course, I wasn't going to let that happen and expose Mary and Karen and Jeannie to that. But now I had established the grounds that even if I was going now myself, I was going under duress. I wasn't going voluntarily, I was being given no choice. The ambulance then reappears. The guard said, well, you have to come now. So I said, fine. And I get into the back of the ambulance. Just before they closed the door, and I said to Mary, Mare, no matter whatever happens, I'll always love you. So anyway, they closed the back of the ambulance. The ambulance arrives into Waterford Regional and brought into this room. I remember thinking, it was a stone wall, one single bedroom. And I remember thinking to myself, geez, like a little bit of a dungeon, you see, because no windows or anything. And this doctor comes in. He says to me, well, I want to give you some medication. It's only a mild sedative. And I said, doctor, I'm not taking medication voluntarily. This doctor says to Mary, Karen and Jeannie, look, he won't take medication, and look how agitated he is. And my daughter Karen said, but doctor, he looks awfully calm to me.
At that stage, he was completely calm, like completely calm. He was sitting on the bed and he wasn't saying anything. He wasn't behaving erratically or anything like that.
The doctor just ignored her, totally. And he then said, well, look, you can leave now. And then they said, you're not going to take it, we're going to have to impose it on you. And they injected me into my back with one of the most powerful antipsychotic drugs. I discovered it was haloperidol. My body was having all sorts of powerful reactions, which apparently this drug causes as side effects. And during that day, there was a patient called Mark, and he said to me, you're having a reaction from the drug. You have to go to the nurse or the doctor and tell them this. But I continued to go into these physical spasms of an enormity. It was terrorizing.
He had had the drugs administered, so he was a little bit like he was dragging his foot when he was walking. You know, he wasn't himself.
During that time, my sister had visited, and she saw the state I was in, and she said that my hair was like on the head of a corpse. And she got so panicked, she went and alerted the rest of the family that there was something terrible happening. And eventually this person, Mark, insisted that finally you have to go now, there's a new nurse on duty. And I went to that new nurse, and I told her the state I was in, and she gave me Valium. And then what happens is I go to sleep. I did research on what this drug, and of course what I discovered was that it does create all sorts of these physical spasms in the body, and I can't lift my feet and I'm trundling around the place. And also, interestingly enough, when I researched it, I discovered haloperidol should be immediately discontinued and appropriate supportive therapy initiated as soon as symptoms of what's called neuroleptic malignant syndrome, NMS, are discovered. That, in other words, it's supposed to be stopped if the person's having side effects, but in my case, they continued for 10 days.
The sequence of events was fourfold in my perspective of the wrongdoings. The first was the doctor coming to his home and signing a form for Eddie to be admitted to hospital as a public patient when he knew that Eddie was in fact a private patient. The significance of that is that the then legislation, the Mental Treatment Act 1945, provided for 2 GPs to sign in a private patient, but only 1 GP to sign in a public patient. And so the original signature was insufficient in the ordinary way because it was only half of what was required to commence Eddie's admission to hospital. The second breach was the involvement of An Garda Síochána. There were very limited powers for An Garda Síochána to escort people to hospital under the 1945 Act, and they did not apply in these circumstances. The third was the actual admission to hospital, upon which almost immediately the administration of drugs against Eddie's will took place. This was on the 9th of February of the relevant year, when he was still not formally admitted to hospital but was brought there as a patient by the Gardaí. That being so, until he was formally admitted, he retained all of his constitutional rights, including his right to refuse medication if that was the case. And yet we know that he was forcibly administered with psychotropic drugs on the 9th of February. The final substantial breach of his rights was the signing off on the actual admission itself, which took place on the 10th of February. So it was a 4-stage process with breaches of his constitutional rights every time. The administration of haloperidol by injection against Eddie's will constitutes a very serious assault at a time when he was in unconstitutional and unlawful detention. But such administration is really medically a last resort, and to be assaulted in the way that Eddie was constitutes a very grave assault on his person. I did umpteen of these cases back in the 1990s. In my experience, there were breaches in almost every admission, in fact, of one kind or another. I trained as a solicitor in England and transferred to Ireland in 1992. I was appalled when I came to Ireland and saw that there was no judicial type supervision of the process of either detaining patients short-term or long-term, and I knew that that was also a breach of the European Convention of Human Rights by a promise from the Irish state that they would bring about reforms to the Mental Treatment Act 1945. The result was the Mental Health Act 2001. You needed a specific psychiatric opinion to certify the admission on psychiatric grounds of a patient under the 2001 Act. I feel very proud if I am given any credit for bringing it about. But in reality, the state had been well aware for a very, very long time of the shortcomings in their system.
On Monday, the 25th of February, which was, I was little over 2 weeks in Waterford Regional under false imprisonment, I had already decided I was going to break free of it, which on the Monday I did. I wasn't discharged, I freed myself from it. That same day I had already announced that I was calling another directors' meeting, and therefore I was going to have the time to give the reasons why this company shouldn't be sold. My solicitor told me that if the vote isn't changed on that day, I didn't have any more time. Then the contract was already signed, so he gave me one final day, and that's the day I had this directors' meeting.
Dad phoned up John and asked him to confirm if he had expressed interest in the business, and John confirmed that. I was listening on the other line. I was just surprised because he had been so emphatic about denying it, before, and then when my dad was putting it to him that he was actually interested, he wasn't denying it and he was confirming it, and I was just very confused. I didn't really know what was going on. Different way, it wouldn't have solved all my dad's problems because people still thought he had mental health issues.
At the second directors' meeting, things had changed. Company secretary at the time was a witness, and Eddie had the phone on speakerphone. John declared that he had made an offer, himself and an associate of his, who wanted to invest money in the business. And what they wanted was to buy half of Eddie's shares in the business. Who was it, who was it to believe? I mean, the two people had known very, very well, with two completely different stories, and now it's been confirmed. And it just seemed totally bizarre.
The vote was taken, and the previous vote was overturned, and I had won.
Generally, when a company is in that deep in debt, it's not generating profits, when it's in that kind of position, it generally doesn't come back from the brink. Like I said, it usually ends up being liquidated. I did find it surprising that the company was able to reverse its fortunes, or the driving force really was Eddie in getting the company back on track again. Without Eddie, it just wouldn't have happened.
Whenever I'm considering a decision, I find by coming here, the atmosphere is extraordinary, sort of clear, quiet, and I find I can think more clearly and also sense more clearly that then I can be here with myself. It has this extraordinary well where the water is purified coming up through the limestone in a manner in which few wells in the world create this level of clarity and purification. Going back to the event itself, people will have construed that I had a breakdown, but I actually didn't have a breakdown. I had what I claim to have been a breakthrough. And I can perfectly understand that people would have perceived I had some sort of a breakdown. That's something I always have respected in people, even since then. The 17-month experience itself was incredibly challenging. Obviously incredibly challenging for my wife and children, but also incredibly challenging for me in a different way. I now fully realize that the completion of that initiation, it was necessary to somehow me to have to enter that hospital and in a sense achieve what I managed to achieve inside the imprisonment of that hospital. For the whole experience then to have completed itself in a manner in which it's been such an extraordinary outcome and gift in my life. That's why I have no sense of revenge and no recriminations, and for my own personal benefits, I wouldn't change the history. But for the sake of Mary and Karen and Jeannie, more than likely would, because then they wouldn't have had to go through what they went through all those years ago.
Like seeing your dad go through that, yeah, it was just really difficult, yeah.
I'm delighted that Eddie has come through all of this and that his life has turned around in such a positive way. And he could certainly be an inspiration to many, because most people find depression a terrible thing to go through, but occasionally people do react like Eddie does and see it as a gift in disguise in retrospect, and something that they take with them in a positive way for the rest of their lives. But to those people that are listening and that believe they may be able to manage without medication, what I would say is, if you're on medication and you're living the same life that Eddie O'Brien is, you're getting on with things, please don't upset it. Please don't destabilize things by getting rid of your medication, because if it is helping you to function normally and to live a fulfilled and happy life, please stick with it.
It's one thing to be stigmatized if you're supposed to have depression, but it's another thing to be stigmatized because you've been forcibly locked up in a mental hospital. That's another level of stigma. Me being locked up in a psychiatric hospital allowed me get a much deeper understanding of how powerful stigma was. Then, of course, that had me asking the question, but what is really motivating this mental stigma? You see, in my case, what I noticed was people are frightened of people with mental illness. Because there's a mistaken relationship, there's a tremendous fear, which may be unnecessary. Then I started to research. St. Patrick Hospital in Dublin had done an extraordinary report. 65% of Irish people believe that being treated for a mental health issue is a sign of personal failure. 20% of people are unsure that they would want to live next door to somebody who previously had a mental health problem. 15% of people are not sure if people with mental health issues should have children. So these are just some of the things they discovered. So that's in the Ireland of today. People falsely believe that people who have mental illness are more violent and more dangerous than people who don't have mental illness. It is something that needs to be more deeply explored. Where to start? Here's a good place to start, actually. The Nature of Prejudice is the title of the talk. The word means to prejudge. Prejudice is an image, and an image can potentially get dissolved in the presence of a physical person. In other words, often you may have encountered an idea, or somebody's told you that such and such a person is a complete disaster, and you've never met that person. So naturally your mind will form an image, and if it didn't have the capacity to form images, you couldn't function at all, you see. But then you meet that person, and suddenly you're talking to him, and the image is sort of, this is not the way the person I thought is at all, so the image is dissolving. The end game is respect. The more respect we can have for one another, the more there's a respect for difference. And if you look at nature, it's full of diversity, but it's because of its diversity that it's creating these wonderful things that nature creates. So obviously, if there's a greater respect for difference and diversity, then other natural wonderful things will emerge. And one of those may be an increase in respect. But what does the word respect means? It means looking anew. Not looking at them through the eyes of what's gone before. But what I noticed was that there was fear. I noticed that there was fear in people encountering people with mental illness. And I was wondering, where's that fear coming from? It seems something very deep, you see. The question is, for me, what is going on that allows the human mind to look at a human person in that way? Instead of, let's get rid of it, why is it occurring? What's behind it? Once then stigma is understood in a deeper way, it's not a question then of having to get rid of it. The understanding itself is the getting rid of it.
If I get to know somebody who was in a mental hospital, already stigma is in operation, I might not even be able to listen to such a person. And even further, that the family of a person being locked up in a mental institution, the whole family can be stigmatized. So that's how strong that can be, and that's a sad thing. I was interested in the metamorphic association, and through getting to know the founder, Gaston Saint-Pierre. The metamorphic association is a platform to meet other people, sharing on the same level about transformation and these things which caught my interest. And Eddie at that time was also running an Irish association. So he invited me to Ireland and meet that group. I could already pick up some weird things there, that people were reacting a bit strange towards Eddie, I would say. But at that time I did not know anything about Eddie's adventure, but I found it really profound what he was sharing about his insights. So for me it was clear I want to hear more of what he has to share. Eddie was already a trustee of the International Association as well. The Board of Trustees was ready to actually vote for a new director, and it was unanimously voted for Eddie being the new director, because he was having the qualities which were necessary that such an organization can survive. He was functioning so well, it was totally outstanding for me, and I actually asked him, how come? And he said, well, Chris, I wasn't like that before. I went through some challenging times. People like Eddie, who obviously went through enormous suffering and came out of it like that. What is that telling us? Yeah, that the possibilities are endless, and that is extremely meaningful, because it means that even when you feel totally stuck, it not necessarily stays, because life is movement, and that natural movement of transformation is always intact. He once said, I was falling in love with life, and that also stayed with me when he said that. And I can truly witness that's the case.
Eddie's probably been a colleague and friend for around 30 years. We had a lot in common. We were both business people and also had a deep interest in the dialogue process. It led to us doing some dialogue work in Ireland. I invited Eddie to become a trustee of prison dialogue. Kind of lost contact. Out of the blue came a call from his wife saying Eddie had disappeared. And when we did reconnect, it was by telephone, he clearly wanted to talk. He'd had a complex and powerful experience of some kind, and he had a large amount of information about an extraordinary story. And on Friday afternoons, maybe once a month for a year or two, we went into the story. Affected his wife and in turn his marriage, and ended up with him being wrongfully imprisoned. As I heard the story, I started to wonder about the validity of it. When you look at the cost, which included the loss of a marriage, the loss of public reputation, the loss of freedom, and so on, there were clearly material loss and a valid claim. I found people other than himself who confirmed each of the key points. And the beginning of making clear that Eddie's views about his experience were accurate, and that he is obviously of clear and sane mind in recounting what had happened. The reason I felt the story was of value is many people are caught up in a sequence of unfortunate incidents and don't make it through. Eddie worked out how to get there. He not only got out of hospital, he also saved his business. He continued in good relationship with Mary and with his children. It's really a success story. The peculiar thing about Eddie's story is that it relates to mental illness. Now, people are frightened of mental illness. They believe that people who have mental illness behave irrationally and may be dangerous. And I believe in Ireland there's a particular prejudice, by which I mean an assumption about people who are labelled to have mental illness. I would hope a film like this would lead some of us to re-examine our disposition to mental illness, to rather understand what's actually happening and to check the validity of our views, and give some encouragement to people who may be suffering in such a way that there is a way through.
Mary was one of the people that didn't fully know her own value in that sense. There was this extraordinary innocence and extraordinary dignity that was never lost. And she was killed in an accident in 2005. I realised that couldn't have been what happened and so beneficial without my wife Mary being present for those 17 months. So she's an incredible influence in all of this, which she wouldn't have realised herself. I was one of the people that spoke at the funeral, and I said the most important gift she had provided me with was that she was in love with life. Why do I think this extraordinary event happened to me? The one thing I would say is that somehow or another, because of my involvement in the whole subject of transformation, in other words, how can something that appears maybe awful transform into something that's a gift? Maybe it happened to me because I was already prepared for it. I said to somebody, I'm after falling in love with life. I was now experiencing an inner security and an inner freedom which was unimaginable before the experience. And that brings an extraordinary thing into my life, which is that when challenges come my way, I'm constantly alert to the potential of the challenges. And that in some extraordinary way, every event in life, internally or externally, contains the hidden potential